So thank you for this opportunity. And before I share a few slides, I'm going to just say one or two remarks. I think that the global historical context is so important to situate uh, what is the environment in which Canada is moving through this process of turbulence. Right now, we know that there is an inflaming situation in the Middle East. That's something which is potentially going to alter human civilization in a very bad way if cooler heads don't prevail. And it doesn't look like there are too many cooler heads in the room, especially in the wake of the recent Israeli attack onto various sites in Iran. I don't know how Iran's going to respond. We know that it could get very ugly very fast. I don't know what degree there was collaboration amongst Trump's networks. I just don't know. There's a lot of things we're not aware of. We also know that there is a color revolutionary effort that has come home to roost. We've seen little samples of this in 2020 or 2019 in the wake of the George Floyd death and the George Soros funded operation to try to light America on fire. And it's coming back in a big way there too. This Saturday, there's coordinated, I think, something like 1,400 mass protests. A lot of it utilizing violent agencies, violent actors who were brought in from the Mexican border, who have been sleeper cells, sleeper agents that appear to have connections, though I don't know of the smoking guns yet, to many of those CIA, NED style operations that have destabilized and overturned governments over decades and decades abroad. But here it is coming home to the United States. I believe that these are likely two connected uh, things that are happening as we speak right now. But that context is so important in order to properly appreciate some of the elements that I'm going to be talking about today. That will go into some of the untold history of Canada's fight for progress, which is what I've chosen to label today's very brief presentation. I might skip over a few slides because it's again a very large presentation. Um, and a lot of this emanates from my book series, The Untold History of Canada, volumes 1 to 4, especially this particular book I have in my hand, which is called The Forgotten Struggle for Progress, featuring Daniel Johnson Sr., De Gaulle, Diefenbaker on the book cover. That's all available on the CanadianPatriot.org website for those who want to dig in a little bit more deeply into some of the stories. I'm going to begin here with a message from none other than Lord Alfred Milner, who is a key figure that is undervalued as far as his influence in shaping or misshaping 20th and 21st century politics. Lord Alfred Milner was the head of the Cecil Rhodes Trust uh, grouping that set up an agency known as the Roundtable Movement in England, with branches in Canada and the United States and New Zealand and Australia and South Africa. He also became the Minister of the Colonies, and he was a co-author of the Balfour Accords, along with his colleague Lord Balfour, that drafted and set up the stage in 1917 for what became later on the state of Israel as we know it after World War II. But he came into Canada in 1909 with a friend of his from the Fabian Society named Halford Mackinder. Um, and both of them were strategizing together on how to deal with a problem that was caused by Prime Minister Laurier at the time, which was to create an alliance with a protective tariff around the USA and Canada, driven by a revival of a Lincoln-style greenback policy for the industrialization of Canada and the United States together to block the cheap dumping of foreign goods and to drive industrial progress internally, not not at all like the NAFTA that we've come to know and hate in later years. This was a very different idea, but that had to be stopped. And so Milner and Mackinder being the father of modern geopolitics, came to Canada and formulated a strategy where Milner stated in 1909, as between the three possibilities of the future, which is number one, closer imperial union, that is between Canada and England, union with the UK, the USA, and number three, independence. I believe definitely that number two is the real danger. I do not think the Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflection on the big issues and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger to ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness and future of their country, and so forth, would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity on the basis of, quote, partner states. People wonder why Mark Carney chose to invite King Charles to Canada to open up the recent parliamentary session. Why was Mark Carney also the president of the Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs? What was his role as the governor of the Bank of England? To understand these, or what's his relationship with Chrystia Freeland, a Rhodes Scholar? Well, to understand that, one would need to know that Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, that Carney was the president of the Rhodes Scholarship, that Chrystia Freeland and Bob Rae were also products of, were all part of this Cecil Rhodes Lord Milner operation that was set up in 1902. At this time, there's an amazing paper written by Robert Ainsworth, published a few years back, which goes through the deep history of how Wilfrid Laurier was overthrown in a soft coup in 1911, after which Wilfrid Laurier writes to O.D. Skelton, who later on becomes Minister of External Affairs, stating that Canada is now governed by a junta sitting at London known as the Round Table, with ramifications in Toronto, in Winnipeg, in Victoria, with Tories and Grits receiving their ideas from London and insidiously forcing them onto their respective parties. Again, the essay that I referred to by Robert Ainsworth deals with the Masonic Orange Order, as well as the Roundtable movement, then led by Lord Milner, that overthrew Laurier and brought in Robert Gordon, who then later on dragged Canada into World War I and was awarded by becoming made president of the Canadian Institute for International Affairs in 1928 as its first president, that same Prime Minister Robert Gordon. For those who don't know, that institute that I just mentioned was the Canadian branch of Chatham House that I'm going to say something about in a second. We're going to skip this Carroll Quigley quote because it's very big, but that book is essential reading, I think, for any Canadian who wants to understand what is this secret history called the Anglo-American Establishment. Quigley eloquently gets at the role of this secret agency that was set up by multi-generational operatives through the Rhodes Trust operation, the Rhodes Scholarship operation, and the Roundtable movement, especially with a focus on their influence in England and also in Canada. He does quite the job at just demonstrating the power, the disproportionate power and influence of this agency. It's quite astounding. To get across the manifesto of what drove the spirit, the constitution of this new secret order that would indoctrinate talented young people from around the world in the halls of Oxford and then redeploy them back to penetrate various governments that, through everything that had influence, the government, agencies, public, corporate, media, you name it, military, whatever could be penetrated. That's what their assignment was. And they would often operate with the London School of Economics's Fabian Society operatives in tandem, as Pierre Trudeau came out of both of those processes together in 1949 when he was sent back from Harold Laski's patronage at the London School of Economics, as well as William Yandell Elliott's Rhodes Scholar operation in Harvard, to get a handle on managing the Privy Council office in Ottawa that he started running in 1950 and interfacing with a network of Rhodes Scholars that later on first dechristianized Quebec, which Pierre Trudeau played a key role in, as well as later on applying the same model on the federal level in 1968 to 72. So Cecil Rhodes stated in his seventh will that he wishes that his funds that he got from basically raping Africa be set up for the establishment, promotion, and development of a secret society, the true aims and object whereof shall be for the extension of British rule throughout the world, the colonization by British subjects of all lands where the means of livelihood are attainable by energy, labor, and enterprise, and especially the occupation by British settlers of the entire continent of Africa, the Holy Land, the Valley of the Euphrates, the island of Cyprus and Candia, the whole of South America, the island of the Pacific, not heretofore possessed by Great Britain, the whole of the Malay archipelago. These aboard of China and Japan, and the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. So when King Charles offered Donald Trump the opportunity to rejoin or join as associate member of the British Commonwealth, and Donald Trump said, "I love King Charles. That's a great idea." People said he was just joking or play acting. I honestly don't know. I don't know if Donald Trump was play acting or if this is a real fatal blind spot in his thinking. I don't know. The Roundtable Timeline, 1902, the Pilgrim Society is founded in the USA and London, two branches, both devoted to the establishing of an Anglo-American alliance for world control. This happened months after William McKinley, the last Lincoln Republican, was murdered by a London-centered anarchist terrorist cell, then centered in Buffalo, also had weird branches in Toronto. That's a weird story. Later on, when Lord Milner takes control of England through a soft coup in 1916 and steers the Lloyd George government, which is a roundtable government, he sets the stage for controlling the terms of the Versailles Agreement. That includes also the establishment in 1919 of the League of Nations that was to become the basis of a one world government. At the same time, 1919, the Anglo-American Institute of International Affairs was formed with branches in London and New York. It gets a name change in 1926, becoming the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, the same thing Mark Carney was president of. And in 1921, the New York branch became known as the Council on Foreign Relations, which Hillary Clinton called in 2009 the mothership, as far as that which shapes foreign policy, especially in the United States. Some of the key Rhodes Scholars that penetrated over several generations in Canada included Vincent Massey, who was the head of the Roundtable movement and the first Canadian-born Governor General. He was initiated in Oxford directly under the tutelage of Lord Alfred Milner, and then sent back to manage the Roundtable movement, which he did for a number of decades. Norman Robertson, Jack Pickersgill, Arnold Heaney, Lester B. Pearson was a Massey Oxford scholar, Escott Reed, F.R. Scott, Hume Wrong, all of which are, this is a small sample of the influential Rhodes Scholars that shaped so much of Canada's identity. I would also include here on this list 5 Rhodes Scholars and 1 leading Fabian that set up something in 1931 to solve the Great Depression called the Canadian Fabian Society, to be modeled directly upon the British Fabian Society that ran the Labour Party in 1901. That was when it was created, and they wanted a Canadian variation for the scientific management of Canada under a scientific elite. Again, these figures were 5 of which of the founders were Rhodes Scholars, one of whom was a major handler of a young Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that is F.R. Scott, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau returned from London to Ottawa to learn the ropes of the Privy Council management of the real shadow governance of Canada. That is, the Privy Council is the agency that shapes most of the big decisions that influence Canada's domestic policy, and I would say to a degree, foreign as well. Escott Reed, who was one of the co-founders of the Canadian Fabian Society and Rhodes Scholar, also was a lesser known real brainchild behind what became the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And in 1947, at a Cochiching conference that set up the stage for what became NATO, he literally called for, well, yeah, this is a quote from his speech where he said, "It would be easier and more self-respecting for Canada to give up to an international body on which it was represented the decision on which it should go to war than to transfer the right to make that decision from the government in Ottawa to the government in Washington. It would thus appear probable that effective military cooperation between Canada and the United States is possible only within the framework of an effective world order of which both Canada and the United States are loyal members." So basically the idea of, this is not a new idea. It was pretty much every Rhodes Scholar advances this idea that everybody needs to just give up their sovereignty to a one world authority. He was also the president of the Canadian League of Nations Society. So that was the basis of Covenant 11 of the League of Nations Covenant, the abolition of claims to sovereignty, especially over military decisions, with the idea that a one world government under the influence of things like the Bank of England and elite technocrats that are more detached from the parochial concerns of tribalism and nationalism would guarantee world peace forever. That's at least the promise that these guys, or the Kool-Aid that they wanted everybody to drink. Okay, so that's just some of the nefarious actors that I just wanted to introduce. Again, the books, I've written books about this, other people have written books about this, so I'm scratching just a little bit to give you a flavor of some of these things. Now, from this standpoint of the positive story, what you have there is a picture of W.A.C. Bennett, William Cecil Bennett, Premier of British Columbia from 1952 to 1972, and I would say an underappreciated hero that whose real victories and battles have largely been written out of our own history. And Bennett said, I'm just going to minimize this. Of all the interests I have in public life, none is a greater challenge. No money in this province could pay me for the satisfaction I would feel if this railroad were changed from a joke and put on a sound financial basis. What's he speaking about? He's referring to what you see there is on the right, the actual rail, the first phase of the rail operation. There was a two-phase vision that he had to build rail to open up the north of British Columbia, which had been withheld from development due to an imperial strategy that had been in place for over 150 years, even before Bennett became premier. And that program was premised on the idea that Canada should remain a barren wasteland, or as Sir John A. Macdonald had said, I would prefer to keep Canada a barren wasteland for generations, except that I know that if we do not build rail across Canada and go there, then the Yankees certainly will, which is why he reluctantly allowed for the development of rail, only knowing that um, the Yankees, then influenced by the followers of Abraham Lincoln, were going to certainly develop the continent with rail stretching through British Columbia, the north, through Alaska, that had just been recently sold to the Americans and beyond. So Bennett was trying to revive this effort that the Lincoln Canadians, the Lincoln admiring Canadians from a century earlier, had been fighting for by opening up again rail, get access to the resource development as well as the different um, I mean, there's a lot of potential up in the north, as well as, and you can see from his figure on the left, the plan was to connect it into the Yukon Northwest Territories and ultimately Alaska. Only half of it happened. There were sabotage operations, which I'll say a word about, but that resulted in basically the rail going to Dawson's Creek, Dawson Lake, and nowhere further than that. Um, a big part of that became a joke known as Bennett's Folly, or the rail to nowhere that the Canadian government tried selling for $1. But they don't realize that it wasn't just to build rail into the north and not do anything else. That was simply an unfinished project. That was also part of what made Bennett's vision for hydroelectric dam building possible. Was building the rail there, but he had an idea, as he writes here. This is the most momentous announcement I've ever made. The studies being conducted in the north indicated the feasibility of establishing in the Rocky Mountain Trench the greatest hydroelectric project in the world, and would be entirely in the control of the government of British Columbia. This day is the most important that BC has experienced in its whole history. Surely now both Ottawa and the USA will realize that we mean business. And of course, he's referring to the Peace River um, dam that, including the Wollaston Reservoir that was built up in the north of BC, which supplied an immense amount of electricity, both for the industrialization and modernization of British Columbia as a territory, as well as a lot of revenue, having sold a lot of this to the United States through its Columbia River Treaty program, as well as in the upper Columbia in blue is an image of three dams that were built on the Canadian side under Bennett, and one dam on the American side that also were built during Bennett's time and with the full support of John F. Kennedy. Now, Ottawa was against both of these projects, the rail development as well as the dam building. We know that Bennett was dealing with the Ottawa-run BC Power Corporation, which is a private entity called BC Electric, that was doing things only for money and preventing the the availability of electricity for industry or residential use. So it was really withholding the development aspirations of BC as a potential. So he had a big fight with that entity for a number of years, and ultimately was able to nationalize them, creating BC Hydro. That's where it came from. The figures within Ottawa who played a key role in preventing him from doing a lot of this work was run by a Rhodes Scholar operation in Deacon Baker's cabinet known by Davy Fulton. Davy Fulton was a Rhodes Scholar who had a grouping of sociopathic young men called Fulton's Boys, one of whom was Oxford-trained Mark Lalonde, who came in with Pierre Trudeau, set up the Club of Rome in Canada in 1968 as part of the Trudeau takeover that happened later on. Another one was Michael Pitfield, another Trudeau acolyte who worked with Trudeau to de-Christianize Quebec. That same Michael Pitfield was then working for Davy Fulton, and together they were part of this operation to prevent Bennett from accessing credit or from even getting authorization, because every decision made that involves cross-border development between BC or any province and another foreign country does require federal support. If it happens within the confines of province, it is fully under the authorization of the province according to Section 92 of the BNA Act. And I'm not a fan of the BNA Act. I think it's a joke. But that being said, it does give provinces a huge amount of authority to make decisions unilaterally on their future, how they develop their resources, as well as how they develop relations with each other. That's a big part of what makes Canada's success story work. That this development that improve the quality of life, standards of living, productive powers of British Columbia didn't happen because of Ottawa, but in spite of it, and with the support and collaboration with other provinces, especially with Quebec. Here are just some of the anti-Malthusian nationalists of Quebec. Daniel Johnson Sr. became premier in 1966. He died a mysterious death in 1968. He was close friends with Charles de Gaulle, the Republican and friend of John F. Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy of France, who came to Quebec and had a strategy there. Johnson had formerly been Minister of Northern Resources, where he was in charge in the 1950s under the Union Nationale government of spearheading the hydroelectric development of Quebec. He was also friends with Jean Lesage, who modeled himself as a seedy Howe liberal patriot, somebody who was ultimately not useful for those wishing to control Quebec with a different idea in mind. But together, they couldn't get money for the development of these hydroelectric dams that became sort of the foundation of Quebec as a hydroelectric renaissance. I mean, the fact that there's an engineering renaissance that happened with a huge amount, I think 97% of Quebec's electricity comes from hydroelectric power. This was made possible principally through the efforts both of the Union Nationale government of the 1950s, but not because of Ottawa, but because they had rather had credit unions that they were able to utilize funding by the people for the people that developed a lot of these investments into these strategies, as well as a $100 million loan in 1961 that W.A.C. Bennett gave to the government of Jean Lesage in order to build the James Bay hydroelectric dams that we see up there on the upper left-hand side, as well as many of the dams in the south, and the initiatory investments for nuclear that became the foundation of the 3 nuclear reactors that were built up by Quebec, but all decommissioned in subsequent years by those Malthusians who would prefer to keep the world stuck in scarcity. So that was because of the PC loan to Quebec that made that possible. I'm sorry, I hear a voice there. Is there a question?
Just listening to a podcast.
Okay. That I heard. Okay. All right. So I'll just wrap it up here. Like I mentioned, those particular individuals, Michael Pitfield, Mark Lalonde, Michael Pitfield, by the way, is the guy who ends up setting up CSIS, the Canadian variation of, I guess you could say, the CIA in some ways, in 1983, when the RCMP Special Operations Unit that was found to be caught red-handed one too many times, overseeing terrorist cells, Maoist Leninist terrorist cells like the FLQ in the 1960s and 70s, when the RCMP was discovered to be behind many of those false flag operations, including what led up to the October crisis that undermined many of the more authentic independence movements of Quebec. They had to then create what was known as a new rebranded version of the same thing through the CSIS agency, a more civilian cover group that happened at the same time as the National Endowment for Democracy was created in 1983 as well, taking over the functions of many of the things the CIA was doing, overthrowing governments, carrying out black operations like COINTELPRO to radicalize nationalist movements and then destroy them from within. I don't think that that year was a coincidence. And lastly, James Coyne, the Rhodes Scholar, Bank of Canada governor, fired by Diefenbaker in 1958, the only time a sitting governor of the Bank of Canada was fired, and who was a principal enemy of W.A.C. Bennett, the Union National Party. Um, he was also a key figure who was trying to constrict revenue for Bennett to carry out his vision, as well as the Union National Government. I didn't mention this, but Wilfrid Laurier was a Lincoln admiring Republican fighter in 1864 when he was a member of the L.O. David Calixte-Lavallée grouping in Quebec called Les Rouges, and the newspaper that they ran was called the L'Union Nationale. That was the same paper that the later political party of the Union National Government took its inspiration from. Ironically, it's just a little bit of an interesting tie-in to the original quote by Laurier, who was ousted by the Roundtable movement. This is the agency at the Université de Laval with Pierre Trudeau, Marc Lalonde in the picture. Another guy, Jean Beets, was a Rhodes Scholar. He's at the bottom left. And Paul Guérin-Lejoie was another member of this thing that oversaw the dechristianization program in the 1950s and throughout the 1960s, leading up to especially the 1970 October crisis, when Pierre Trudeau was able to wield the power of the Canadian military, bringing tanks onto the streets of Montreal, and which also saw the murder of Deputy Premier Pierre Laporte, who was, I think, one of the last beacons of resistance trying to fight against this takeover at the time. And when he died, in a way that was similar as a model of murder to what killed Prime Minister Aldo Moro in Italy in 1974. In the same way, their bodies were discovered in cars, in both cases by Maoist Leninist front organizations, the Red Brigades in Italy, the FLQ in Quebec. Both were tied to intelligence units that had nothing to do with the communist boogeyman we were all being trained to be afraid of during this time. I think that that's also not a coincidence. I mentioned here that this Laval unit was overseen by a figure named Georges-Henri Lévesque. That's him on the right. He was a Dominican priest, the father of Quebec sociology. He is the guy who, from 1934, brought in the first sociology department into Quebec and was a follower of Aldous Huxley and believed that the Brave New World strategy of controlling the world through what Aldous Huxley lays out in his so-called fiction book of 1932 was actually the greatest idea ever. He worked closely with Vincent Massey, overseeing the Massey-Lévesque Commission, which brought in a new identity, or the framework by which a new Canadian anti-American identity could be crafted. The things like the National Film Board, the National Library, the National Art Gallery, the National Art Bank, the Social Society, Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the CBC was created out of this, the Canada Council for the Arts that centralized grant giving powers to a central executive agency that had formerly been under the management of the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundation before this happened, as well as the Order of Canada to create a British modeled order for Canadian elites to self-gratify themselves. One of the guys who worked very closely with Vincent Massey and Georges-Henri Lévesque on that commission was, on the left there, George Grant, who was the assistant to Vincent Massey and was a co-author of the Massey-Lévesque Commission report of 1951. And George Grant became the father, with another guy on the right there, who was the former president of Canada's Privy Council and finance minister, named Walter Lockhart Gordon. George Grant was himself a Rhodes Scholar from Oxford, and he wrote down that the aspirations of progress have made Canada redundant. The universal and homogenous state is the pinnacle of political striving. Universal implies a worldwide state, which would eliminate the curse of war among nations. Homogeneous means that all men would be equal and war among classes would be eliminated. The masses and the philosophers have both agreed that this universal and egalitarian society is the goal of historical striving. It gives content to the rhetoric of both communists and capitalists. This state will be achieved by means of modern science, a science that leads to the conquest of nature. That's a very dystopic comment directly from his Lament for a Nation that became kind of a gospel to organize young baby boomers around a new kind of nationalism that would be more in favor to the type of idea that was extolled by none other than Lord Alfred Milner in 1909, for those who remember his very condescending quote about the wonderful immaturity and ignorance of Canadians who, yeah, that's a very, very sick quote. And again, Walter Lockhart Gordon, another co-founder, another co-father of the new nationalism that sprung out of 1963 with the ouster of John Diefenbaker, is a guy who was the executive director of Canada's Chatham House, the Canadian Institute for International Affairs, working closely under Vincent Massey, who was still Governor General of Canada at that time, and who worked with other people like a Rhodes Scholar Governor General Roland Michener, who set up the Club of Rome with Marc Lalonde, Pierre Trudeau, Michael Pitfield in 1968 under the oversight of Sir Alexander King. Sir Alexander King, let me just do a stop share here, is I think most people here might have heard of his name, was the scientific director of the British Empire. He ran the OECD. He brought in cybernetics management into the OECD, as well as general systems planning into all administrations, including NATO, which Escott Reed Rhodes Scholar helped formulate. And the Club of Rome became the foundation upon which the idea of global depopulation would be managed scientifically under an executive elite that would be centered around the figures that I just outlined there. Aurelio Pichet being another one. This was brought into the World Economic Forum in 1973, sponsored by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. That entire 1973 World Economic Forum, which brought in the Club of Rome and their computer models, was done by that guy, unreconstructed SS Nazi, working with Prince Philip. And they're having their meeting today. It's starting in Sweden right now. So I just wanted to emphasize the Bilderberg Group. And now I'll shut up because I went on a little bit longer than 30 minutes, and I'll open up for some I guess, or just hear what comes next.
Well, Matt, let me just start. Could you give us a 2 minute summary of what you're presenting? Like, what's the takeaway for us here?
The only time Canada has ever developed has been not because of Ottawa, but in spite of it, and because provincial, were able to organize populist movements based upon concepts of republican nature that saw a value and a vision in their societies and worked together through things like the ABCY conferences and other things, utilizing the power granted to them through the Section 92 to develop their own resources, even setting up things like banks like the Bank of BC that Bennett set up in order to provide credit for the development of their own future, as well as make foreign treaties, which Canada is uniquely in a position where our provinces are allowed by law to make foreign treaties, and it's happened a number of times with other governments, so that's even possible. So that's my basic message, and that it doesn't happen because of Ottawa. And another message or lesson I wanted people to take away with is that independence movements have failed time and again because people patriots trying to move at various times for their benefit to break away from the empire, as was the case in Quebec, who didn't take the time to properly appreciate what I just talked about the nature of the British Empire's true structure and operating system, always walked into traps that blew up in their faces and killed a lot of people. So that's another point I'm trying to get across here too, because we can see this in the United States too. A lot of foreign agencies with highly sophisticated traps utilizing good people who are too soft-minded to realize what trap is that they're walking into, and find themselves actually playing a, a role to undermine their own society as a whole, as we've seen in Ukraine and Georgia, in every other country where there's been a color revolution that's been sprung. It involves a lot of good people who don't know the terrain that they're operating in. So that's another message I just wanted to try to get across today.
I mean, my takeaway, Matt, is there's a control structure that has no desire for Canada to experience sovereignty or independence, much less the provinces. Have I got that right?
Yep.
Okay, we've got some hands. Patrick, have you got a question for Matt? Patrick? There we go.
Yeah, there's some Matt, you've got to give me a phone call. I could give you so much more information. I posted my phone number stuff that's not available in books, secondhand information. In other words, not me, but somebody else who was there. And I'll just give you one tidbit. My great grandfather, A.P. Patrick, was the first white man out west. He was a personal friend of Sir John A. excuse me, and also, interestingly, a personal friend of Sitting Bull when he escaped the U.S. and went to British Columbia. He was a surveyor. He was the one who laid out the plans for the city of Calgary, and he also was asked to, when others were unable to get the Canadian Pacific through the Rockies by blasting their way, that didn't work, and nobody knew how to get to the Pacific. So he asked his quote Indian friends, and they told him the route to take through the mountains because they knew all the passes and everything. And so it was thanks to him that they, of course, he made a good buck on doing that, and showed them the way to get through the Rockies. So I just thought I'd give you that little tidbit. I could
Yeah,
say
sure.
much more about other things if you want to give me a call,
Well,
especially.
shoot me an email. Ask Ted for my email. Shoot me an email and include your phone number, and we'll chat. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, I'll add my email to the chat then.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Patrick. Northern BC, what have you got?
Okay, I've got a couple of questions.
Hmm.
Many of us have read and shared all the BNA acts and everything that he was mentioning. But what's confusing many of us are he was the fifth person that was supposed to talk last week, and everybody seems to have a different definition of what each one means. So where can we find, or do we just do our definitions of what they mean and proceed ahead? Because Alberta right now is seeking their independence. But if I read everything, especially the Statute of Westminster, it means that we don't have to act. We can just go ahead and do. And if that's the case, can we do it region by region? Because the Northwest Territories split in half and became I'm going to butcher this name.
Nunavut. Nunavut.
Um,
Yeah.
so can Northern BC do that without the benefit of Southern BC? And if so, how?
Yeah. The nuances of that particular question are out of my jurisdiction. What I can say is that if you have a very wisely run uh, independence movement that has a concrete vision of what a real republic that is capable of really having economic sovereignty with all of the mechanism and tools that history has taught us are available to us in place with a vision for the future to animate the growth of that province that wishes to become its own country. I'm all for it. Okay, but you have to have a very wise leadership, very competent, capable, as well as a good, very, very well-developed, disciplined mass base. So a popular mass movement that is also oriented towards moral principles that are very solid. I don't see too much in the way of vision. I see a lot of people who are frustrated with the abuses of Ottawa that have been withholding their aspirations and their rights to control their own destiny. I see a lot of frustration manifesting in a very expected manner in the form of these desires for independence movements. I don't see vision, and I don't see an understanding of how exactly an economy is supposed to work very strong. I'm going to be going to Calgary again. I go there a lot. I'm going to give some presentations in a couple of weeks to an independence movement there. I'm getting to know the terrain and the people, but I'm not seeing that so far. But I agree with you, like in the sense that the BNA Act, which I don't, like I said, I'm not a fan of the BNA Act, but does give provinces who wish to use this power immense amount of control over their destinies. If it's used, it's one of those things. And it could mean, like, we've got cases of provinces who have made foreign treaties, or Quebec has made foreign treaties with African governments over the years, British Columbia in 2016 signed a memorandum of understanding with China on cooperating on BRI infrastructure. I mean, there's other things that we don't see examples of that happening in any other country in the world except for Canada. And I think that's part of, on the one hand, ironically, what the British Empire designed in 1867 or 1864, to keep Canada more divided amongst itself, divide to conquer. So, but on the other hand, when you actually have good moral leadership, they can use that power in a way like Bennett did, or Daniel Johnson Sr. did, to a very good effect if Ottawa is acting like an empire, subverting our desires. So do we need to go independence if we have this thing available to us to use? I don't think we do, but there's a lot of things that are up in the air for me right now. I'm also thinking about it.
Okay, let's get a couple more hands in, and then we need to move on here. Wayne, have you got a question for Matt?
Yeah, I'll be really quick with the question. I'm concerned about the traps that you mentioned that various provinces or regional governments, whatever you want to call them, when they want to secede. What are those traps, and how can we identify, basically, I'm going to call it the bad propaganda that we're all going to be subjected to when things like the referendum start being called and all that stuff?
Well, the kinds that I've seen is the most dangerous, which infiltrated the FLQ. There were a lot of really good people in the independence movement of Quebec in the 60s, but they got completely washed out by the more radical factions that started on the fringe, but then became the voice of the movement, increasingly getting into activity like letter bombs, public forms of terrorism, increasingly, that only justified a heavy-handed martial law clampdown onto the people as a whole, that involved illegal mass arrests in the hundreds in 1970 and the months afterwards, and just general subversion. We've seen that in every case of color revolutionary efforts in the world. So my concern, I was in Ottawa for a big chunk of the trucker convoy, the Freedom Convoy, and I was enlivened and happy to see that these traps, the pallets of bricks, were not used. People were wiser. They didn't fall for these traps to provoke them, even when there were threats to remove their kids from them. People didn't, in desperation and emotion, fall for those things that I think Justin Trudeau would have adored. Chrystia Freeland, Carney would have adored a few rocks being thrown at government buildings or police officers. So that didn't happen. But how much can you really push people before their emotions get ahead of their minds in the context of an economic scarcity situation or crisis? I don't know. A lot of people can break pretty easily. So that's always a concern I have, is the provocateurs, the rabble rousers, who will try to play the emotions, flatter the egos of the mob, and do it in a way to get people to jump before thinking about what they're jumping into. So that's I think the thing that Alberta independence partisans have to think about very seriously, is keeping an eye out for potential provocateurs and things like that.
Thanks.
Spirit Warrior, what have you got for Matt?
Well, I have a master's degree in history, and Matt, I don't know you people, but that was an extremely erudite summary of Canadian history. I want to emphasize the fact that in 1977, a lawyer in BC named Alfred Webermont went to the CIA remote viewing course at Stanford University and was told in 1977 the next 7 presidents, and that after the 7th president, ×2, Trump, in 2025, would lead the charge of the CIA plan to break up North America into 9 parts. And you're seeing that happen right in front of you unless you folks do something. You are in the crosshairs of the CIA. The second thing Matt raised was the massive confusion of what the BNA Act is. I am the Attorney General of the Alliance of Indigenous Nations. We're an Eastern Métis, Eastern Canada group, but we're now international. We have a complete understanding of the BNA Act and the fact that the UN Declaration, the UNDRIP, totally misunderstood by almost everybody in this country, has now been entrenched in the Constitution in Section 35. And that document, Ted, is the only document in Article 44 that is going to give you, Matt's, hope for a republic. Article 44 says the individual men and women, not the legal persons of a corporation in Ottawa. BC is a corporation registered in Washington, D.C. on the SEC, as is Alberta, as is Quebec, as is Ontario, as is Canada. And under Article 44 is the only chance you folks have to realize that you are Indigenous. You've been completely fooled. There's Aboriginal people, there are Greeks, there are Italians, there are Peruvians. Those are cultures. And I'm an expert in that field, taught by many grand chiefs, of the truth of how stupefied we are. I had to learn this in the last 8 years, folks. You can learn it quickly. And I could do a presentation for you, Ted, on the truth of the BNA Act. And international law says that you folks own the resources of this country. And we are the richest country by far in the world, over $700 trillion you're sitting on.
Can you put your email in the chat, and let's find a time for you to come and give us a more detailed understanding? That would be great. Thank you.
Great job, man. Great job.
Yep. Thank you. And thank you for that little briefing too. I appreciate that.
Sarah and Ken, and then I want to move on.
Hi, thank you very much. Two things. First of all, actually what you were talking about the individuals who are planning to become violent has become something that's gotten onto my plate recently, and it's concerning. But I guess my real question is, there's been some chatter in the chat about money and so forth, and I am a separatist. I started out as that, but I hid it in order to promote Smith. A lot of people who were separatists were surprised to hear that from. And I'm starting to honestly feel like, how is Alberta going to achieve this? Because they're going to be bringing in so many things to try to stop us, which I knew anyways. Do you think really that we have a hope? And what do you think is the biggest barrier that we need to be aware of in seeking this?
Boy,
Yeah, yeah, that's a tough one. That's a whole. How much time have you got? No, I know we have to wrap this up. So let's put that on the side. I'm still giving that one a big think, and I'm still in information gathering mode myself. Like I said, I do go to Calgary periodically to speak with different groups, and I'm still getting a mapping of the terrain, getting a sense of the minds of the people who are taking responsibility that I could see at least. And I'm still I'm still information gathering before I pass judgment on the viability of it right now. I don't know.
When are you going to be here? Maybe we could get you to speak at one of our groups here.
Sure, yeah. I'm going up on the 24th for a big conference. If you can contact me through my website or through TED, I can give you that information, and then I'm going to host a little event on the Saturday following that bigger event. I think that's the 27th or 28th, which anybody here who's in that area are more than welcome to come to. But just contact me through the CanadianPatriot.org contact section of my website, which is also where you can get all those books that I mentioned, or through TED. And I'm sure he'll share my email.
Yeah, Matt.
Actually, I've been promoting going to international court prior to even hearing you, because I think that's the best way to do it. But anyway, sorry, Ted, to interrupt you.
Yeah, I'll get the details of Matt's speaking opportunities and share them next week.
Cool.
Okay, Ken, you get the last question.
Okay, thank you. The question I have has to do with the idea of provinces separating from Canada under the, I guess, with the BNA Act. Is there any option for such a province separating from the Dominion of Canada, but remaining part of the Commonwealth? That is, that a province separates but keeps the king as their head of state, but no longer answers to Ottawa. Is that a possibility?
I just don't see why anyone would want that, knowing what the Commonwealth actually is, as far as the control mechanism for total feudal domination over the world through the Privy Council and other things. I would just go for a republic if I were you. If I was going to go in that direction, I would say just try to go for a real authentic republic. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, boy, Matt, you've brought some pretty interesting information to us, and I think about your first slide. I think that talked about how naive Canadians are, and I have to admit that I feel very naive after listening to your presentation.
Thanks for the answer.
We've got lots to learn, and there's a big boy club that has its hooks into Canada that I think if we don't understand what we're up against, we are going to just be easily tossed aside.
Yeah.
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 Thank you. Thank you for presenting today. Well, Tony Hall, you asked if you could share some of your thoughts on the title you've given me is a collision of sovereign agendas in Canada and North America. I suspect that you'll be able to build on some of the things that Matt has talked about. You're muted there, Matt or Tony. Tony, you're still muted.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, can you add to what Matt has started this morning?
Well, I could do things in sort of overview form rather than all of that great detail, and surely it is a way to introduce who Mark Carney is, because Mark Carney does sort of draw upon the very worst of this heritage, really British imperial heritage that is available. I must say that how this is going with this group, starting with the COVIDian crisis, the manufactured crisis, I think it's a kind of appropriate because that in fact was a constitutional modification of Canada. Sort of Parliament was put on the side, Davos was put in.
Hang on,
and
Tony.
yeah.
We're still recording. Ted, would you like to?
Yeah, it's fine with me.
It's okay. Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks for checking. Yep.
Yeah. So the fact that Carney, the transition from Trudeau to Carney, more or less treated it as if the COVIDian years established a precedent, which is just going to be continued. But that precedent isn't little rules and regulations. It was a whole constitutional revision of what the country is. And Carney, is carrying on this heritage. Now, in terms of, things take time to describe. I don't know whether to go into, the cartoon version and go into acceleration mode. I'm happy to say, maybe rather than try to catch up and, that this is a unfolding discussion, and I want to, take part in the bigger picture of it. Like when I saw King Charles III come to Canada, I thought, oh my God, all this issue about sovereignty, different sovereignties being aroused. I was prepared to talk about the Alberta sovereignty movement, the Quebecois sovereignty movement, which has been resuscitated, the whole discourse around treaties and First Nations, and that is a very evolved, highly evolved treaty discussion, sovereignty discussion. And now I think I have to include in that the United States itself, its sovereignty is sort of unclear. It's potentially a sort of civil war situation in the United States. Essentially, the Hispanic population has said, all this stuff about us immigrating or coming illegally into what is Mexico. Part of it is even called Mexico. We know California is Mexico. That, this is caught up with the United States, that the southwestern corner of the United States is Mexico. And so people who are coming from what remains of Mexico into the new Mexico, obviously raise this question about, well, where are the borders? If we were going to have borders, we would have different borders. And the same is actually true with Canada, that a lot of the United States exists on territory that was Canada. That was part of New France, but also Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. That was the territory that was under war in the War of 1812. At one point, the British said that is going to be Indiana, that is going to be the Indian buffer state, and all of that history is hidden. So this inviting of King Charles III, King Charles II is the person who gave Rupert's Land, which is a huge part of Canada, about 2/3 of Canada, to his cousin Rupert, and the Hudson's Bay Company was established. And the Hudson's Bay Company held British sovereignty for 200 years, from 1670 to 1870. And so we talk about the provinces having all these powers, but those are the existing provinces. The maritime provinces, what was Upper and Lower Canada, became Quebec and Ontario, and BC, which was already a colony, a British colony. But the vast territory in the middle there, Rupert's Land, which became something called the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Territories was an innovation in the United States for lands north of the Ohio River, which would essentially be treated as colonies of the central government until such times as the Indians were removed or dealt with, and 60,000 people were non-Indians were there to create a state. That whole system was exported into Canada so that what is now Alberta, Saskatchewan, Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec, this vast part of Canada, and of course the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, all of this was Rupert's Land in the Northwest Territories, which became the Northwest Territories. And so this colonial history runs so deep in the history of the territories of Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba. And then, there was also a treaty session in 1905 when Ontario was going to incorporate the northern part of Ontario. So I'd be willing to leave it at that. I would, like to elaborate a little bit on the points I'm raising, but I'm wanting to talk about different visions of sovereignty, and and do so in a kind of overview, which I think is entirely pertinent to the ins and outs, the actual dynamics of what we're experiencing. I don't think that we've really dealt with the reality that whether we like it or not, we in Alberta or in the West, or we are members of two jurisdictions. We are part of the Dominion of Canada and we're part of Alberta right now. Now, when Quebec was playing its independence card, Québécois were voting for René Lévesque and supporting René Lévesque, who was the sort of founder of the independence movement and a great convivial man of the people who was promoting that movement. At the same time as Québécois were building up that independence movement, they were concurrently voting for Pierre Trudeau, whose position was exactly the opposite. He wants a sea to sea to sea dominion, no special status for any province, no special treatment for any individuals, equal, sort of a Bernier approach. So there were the Québécois who, understand the British parliamentary system because they had to study it very carefully, playing one side against the other, having a great influence over both the independence movement and the federalist movement in Ottawa. And so that to me raises the question that although we may have our heart set on achieving this independence, for the time being, we are not in that position. We still are citizens of the Dominion of Canada. Granted, the Conservative Party is sort of beholden to central Canada and the imperial centers of Canada, but we do have considerable clout with what is going to become of the Conservative Party of Canada. And I think we could be doing much more astute architectural work on playing both levels of government. So those are, I was going to go into some detail to back up these thoughts, But I'll just put out that out there and say we could, solve the stress on us all that if I go on for another 5 or 10 minutes, which is going to be pretty Herculean if I can squeeze something in, I could withdraw at this time, and it would be up to you whether you choose to say this is enough and we've got to the point. But I think I'd rather sort of take advantage of the reality that we had a very solid, important presentation. Thank you, Matt, Ehret, for giving us that detail and introducing yourself. I'm surprised I didn't hear about the James Bay Cree and that amazing treaty process that happened in the 1970s, which is, part of the kind of triumph of the hydroelectrification of northern Quebec. The Indian story and the relationship between Canada and the Crees is a big part of that, with the brilliant Billy Diamond, on the Indian side, negotiating this new era treaty, which starts the process off in BC like a treaty in the 1970s, going back to the positions of, the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This is a big story of the narrative of Canada. And it's sort of the alternate narrative to opening up one resource frontier after the next. Because whenever you get to a new resource frontier, the deal is, well, we have to deal with the Indians. So we've got this very elaborate narrative. First Nations are peoples. They're called the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Peoples have a great deal of personality, legal personality in the United Nations. Not everybody can be a people or a peoples with an end on the word. Also, who else in Canada can really claim to have treaties with the sovereign monarch? Queen Victoria, for instance. I mean, the whole idea that, this is as long as the sun shines and water flows, and we're not doing a treaty with John A. Macdonald or Ed Broadbent, or we're doing a treaty with the part of the system which is supposed to be coherent, continuous, the monarchy. So as long as the sun shines and the waters flow, all of these words are kicking around. So the treaty story, I think, it has to be respected as part of, I think, parties off base to start saying, well, we can just start a new Alberta and ignore it. We're all the same. We just start at the same, That position is well known in Indian country as a kind of exterminationist extinguishment process. Pierre Trudeau tried it in 1969 in the White Paper. We wouldn't want to start an independent Alberta on that basis. So I'll try to leave those thoughts and say I'm willing to withdraw from the picture, but I do want to talk about this. I do feel that at this stage where we're sort of defining the issues and trying to look into the different aspects of it, that I do feel truly that I have something significant to contribute, and I feel the urge to do so. And I don't think it's simply, wanting to see myself, a picture of myself on a screen somewhere. I've been working on this, and this is converging in a way that we've got to keep our wits about us. This is really crucial. This is maybe the biggest historical convergence in our lifetime. And to me, it flows perfectly out of the COVID debacle, because that's where they began to just throw the Constitution, just throw the rule book away, and now they act as if, well, and we also own the king, and look, I can snap my fingers and the king comes over, and oh, look, we're on the same policies, we're into the same issues. I mean, it was almost like a show-off move by Carney to show he has friends in high places. Well, we get that, and it was a kind of, to me, it was demeaning the crown, if you have any respect at all for the institution of the crown. So I keep trying to end it, but I'll really end it there.
Well, Tony, I think you said it just a minute ago. We're trying to get a lay of the land here and figure out what we're up against, what we're involved with, what are the levers of power, where we have some authority and some influence, and where we're being naive and childlike. And Matt's presentation was certainly an eye opener for me. We're these are powerful movements that have been going on for centuries, if not longer. And if we think that it can be easily unraveled with a referendum, I think we're going to get a good smackdown.
Mhm.
There's a couple of hands. Sarah, have you got something for Tony? Sarah? Maybe Sarah stepped away. Olga, have you got a question?
Yeah, I have a question both for Tony and Matt, maybe. What's been rattling around in my brain, and I would really like your feedback. By the way, Matt, really great to see you again. Brilliant as always. What's been rattling around in my brain, and please correct me if I'm wrong anywhere, I would pray that I am. We all know Carney is or was governor of Bank of UK, governor of Bank of Canada. We know that Donald Trump is an expert in bankruptcies from the business perspective over his business career and how to profit from them. And if I'm not mistaken, Mark Carney is also the trustee in bankruptcy for the Crown. The Crown and the monarchy not being one and the same. The Crown actually controls the monarchy. That, to my mind, speaks volumes and leads me to think that maybe Canada is in probate as we speak. And again, that's just my brain rattling around. Does any of that hypothesis make any sense to you guys?
I'll let Tony go
Yeah,
first.
you go.
Yeah. Okay. By the way, hi Tony. How you doing?
Hi.
Long time no see.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm certainly of the view that there are some very shady operations hovering around Trump. To what degree Trump is aware of them or part of it, I am undecided. But certainly, especially through Brookfield asset management, you know, that's a big one. We know that Brookfield is tied very much to the Bronfman operation. Stephen Bronfman's a big player in the Liberal Party still to this very day. The Bronfman clan, Edgar, Peter Bronfman, earlier Samuel Bronfman, are major operatives who played a big role in managing this shit show called the 20th century in the deep state. And it is tied in a variety of points of connection to Trump's apparatus, which bothers me. I've written a thing on that. I'm not going to go into detail here. And certainly the idea of creating sort of a technate concept, you know, for North America. It's something that I think falls in alignment a little bit with Elon Musk's grandfather's agenda, you know, back in the 30s for a North American technate under a divided system within, but a very centralized top-down management system. And I think the Golden Dome notion or the Iron Dome idea that Trump is advancing, that Carney also kind of seems to like, plays into that control grid with a militarized doctrine, which I think is sick and dangerous. So there's a lot of points of red alarms that go up in my mind when I look at those things that are often ignored, that are shaping some of the policies for North America as a whole, including the North American Union idea, right? Mark Carney's wife is a research director at the Canada 2020 think tank, which is run by the Privy Council that selected and ran Justin Trudeau, and that had Thomas Axworthy and Manley, who were both co-architects of the North American Union program to create a euro for North America. That was put on the back burner back in 2007, but it didn't go away. I think it's there are some agencies that would like to use the current crisis as an excuse to reset the world system and create that sort of North American technate idea again, which I fear that these are traps being set that Trump may not understand what they are. I hope for the best, and I hope he's a patriot who has better understanding, but I don't know. I'm not confident.
Okay, I'm going to just make a brief comment,
Mm.
Matt. You and I look at the British Empire in quite a different way. And I don't quite find the demonic quality in it. Like, yes, in the 19th century, people were racists and you know, there was a way of looking at the world, but it was a, you know, that's what historians try to do, is figure out how it was seeming to the people at the time. I know that Lyndon LaRouche figures very prominently in the way you read things. And I think that might be significant for people to understand how you're influenced by that and how it runs through all your analysis, I think, of the British Empire, particularly, and the kind of malevolent character of the British Empire, whereas the, you know, founding of the United States and the initial constitution is kind of the ebullience of brilliance. Anyway, do you care to comment on that, or help me understand that, if I'm stating it
Yeah,
improperly?
Tony. Sure, Tony. Yeah, I like LaRouche. But at the same time, the stuff I went through with my books and the PowerPoint are not things I got from LaRouche. I discovered those on my own, and it happens to be that it substantiates and supports LaRouche's general thesis for a lot of things. But no, I think I made a lot of discoveries on my own and put a lot out there that nobody else has looked at yet. In my books and writings, and the current presentation is just one aspect of that.
All right, we've got two more hands and then I want to move on. Great, Scott, have you got a question?
You're on mute, Scott.
There we go.
There we are. Okay. Yeah. I wanted to thanks, Matt, for that presentation. Great as always. I wanted to, in mentioning the former deal that BC had, I think that needs to be, people need to be reminded of the BC Liberals under Christy Clark. We had the Petronas deal that was under the structure of the Belt and Road Initiative of China's, you know, construction program for the world, that is largely a huge success. And I think, again, I've mentioned this before on this call, that it was the basis for the overthrow of that government, which people will remember was the first coalition government we had in BC, where we had by one seat and Green Party coalition of the NDP and the Green. Weaver from Victoria, right, who won the day for the NDP, and we've been suffering with the NDP ever since. Not to say, but my point is that the larger point that people really need to understand here, I think, is the power shift of world politics has shifted from what we call the transatlantic region, which anyone in economic circles understands, which is the nexus between London, Brussels, Amsterdam, the EU, and the New World, the traditional relationship. That and that relationship has been put to the primary, become the hegemony, with the defeat, essentially, of the traditional role of a balance of power that China has always had in world history for the last 2 millennia. And China, and the interesting part is that the Asian influence on Western Canada is huge. And it is in a vital part, whether it's Japanese or Chinese, is an integral part of Western history. In Vancouver, it's paramount. And we have, for example, you know, Sun Yat-sen Garden that commemorates the Chinese Revolution of 1911. You know, when I ask Canadians about that, they know nothing about this man. And yet he's every bit as important as Lincoln and other historical figures. And he was part of Vancouver's history, part of Western Canada's history. Not only was he supported by the Chinese diaspora in Western Canada, but he was supported by white, essentially white pro-nationalist, Canadian pro-nationalist patriots for a American system revolution for China, not a communist revolution, okay? And this is where we need to understand these kind of things. So my point is, Matt, you want to comment a little bit about the power shift that's happening in the world from an Atlantic region power, which was the hegemony, now back to an Pacific Asian century, which we see and we Canadian patriots must look at, and typified, for example, in the new port development in Peru, that is one of the largest new ports in the world. If there's any information about the development of South America and Mexico, they can add to this information. That's transforming the world center, power center, from the Atlantic, like I say, to the Asia Pacific region. And I must put forward to people that a historical note, the basis of our being British or Western still dominated, hedged upon the Battle of Midway. If that battle were not won by the US Navy, we would be, who God knows what we would be talking Japanese right now. And there would be no English, Australia, or anything. And we vaguely, and if you want, and part of the history is Vancouver Island, the Rangers, which viewed and monitored Japanese submarines off the coast of Canada for invasion. So we need to know a bit of our history. We need to know what the current trend in world politics really is. And we have to lift our heads up to that and understand what is our role? What is our role in that? The other aspect of world development that's happening is Arctic development. And the key thing that people forget too about the British, or Alberta separation and its newfound sovereignty that could exist, is which Matt mentioned, was the connection between Alaska and Alberta. And Trump, in his last term before in September 2020, announced the funding for the Alaska to Alberta Railway, the A to A Railway. That is a game changer, my friends. And that is also what is in the mix. And the other aspect is Arctic development. So if Alberta, here's a non-trap for Alberta separation.
Scott, this quick, because I know that this is for Tony Hall's period as well. So it sounds like you could almost give a presentation in the future at some point. I'll just say, yeah, I think a lot of your considerations have value. But I won't say more than that, because this is Tony's section. So yeah.
Well, I'll just quickly say that one of the strategies that I think Alberta should be playing is Edmonton is a unique urban environment in Canada. It's not that far north, but it is by far the farthest big city north in Canada. And there is a line of involvement of metropolitan authority exercised by Edmonton to the Arctic through the medium of the Mackenzie River, a vast river. And so everything north of Edmonton to the Arctic Ocean, the people who live there and go and spend time in the city, they tend to go to Edmonton or have family in Edmonton, that Alberta should be claiming that region as more connected to Alberta than connected to Ottawa, that those people will make their own decisions. They have, often they've made treaties and they have very elaborate Aboriginal organizations in that part of the country. But we should be playing, that should be part of the hand that we are playing, that really is the hinterland of Edmonton especially, and of Alberta. And if things are going to change in terms of sovereignty, they're going to have their own say over that. On the BC issue, like Indian people in BC, like as Métis are in, say, the Red River area, largely French and Scottish. In the West Coast, the Métis people, or the mixed ancestry people, are largely Japanese and Chinese. And that is a very fascinating aspect of the West Coast culture, that it has that strong element across the Pacific. Families acknowledge their Chinese identity just as they acknowledge their Stalo identity or whatever.
Okay, let's get one last hand in here, Senior Elder, and then I want to move on.
Hi, Okay, what I want to explain is really talking about sovereignty, monarchy with Canada and Canadians. My people were expelled from Scugog Island when the Ontario government said we're going to put in the 100% Indian people and any mixed blood's got to get off the island. We moved further north, and so for about 4 or 5 decades, I tried to purchase the Crown Land Grant patents and purchased the 3 Crown Land patents for the original settlers in the village of Sundridge. As soon as they found out that the Indians were going to be in town, they came and they bulldozed my property. They scraped it bare. They dug up the concrete asphalt, took the 9 residences down, threw us out of the community, and systemic racism, genocide, and expulsion, homeless. And so now what happens, we're in the process of trying to negotiate and resolve the matter. And so what I'm saying is, because I have a 1884 Queen Victoria Crown Land patent to the original Crown Land settler that's been legally assigned to me because I purchased the property, I currently have a contract with King Charles III and myself. And what happened is, because the contractor that came in and took all our assets away and charged us $17,800 a month, and the contractor towing company that took all our vehicles and charged us $10,500 a month, and the municipality that charged us $34,000 for doing what they call cleanup of Indians in the community. I'm now in the process of saying, okay, this is the 2 contractors have committed an offense of a criminal organization. In addition to that, they've turned around and they've created treason to the king. In addition to that, it's high treason because it directly affected the king. And then in addition to that, it's terrorism, and they breached so many sections of the Criminal Code of Canada in terrorism. And so how does your talk relate to that?
Who's the question for? Is that for Matt or for Tony?
Well, I think it deals with who has the expertise to deal with the monarchy or the sovereignty of the Canada belonging to the foreign British Empire, or being administered by the foreign registered Donald Trump Corporation government administration in Canada, registered in Washington, D.C., or is it if the monarchy cedes land to an original settler, does that original settler place between the king and the administrative municipal government, or does the municipal government report to the Ontario government, the Canada government, and then to the king?
I will defer to Tony.
I would just simply say that this very rich and many-faceted presentation involving, so many aspects is just another illustration of the complexity of what we're dealing with. And that it indicates, we really have to grab hold of ourselves and see the larger dimensions. And what you've presented here is just a sort of a case study to say, let's just take a microscope and look at your case and the issues you raise, the deep constitutional jurisdictional issues you raise are amazing. And this is what we're dealing with.
Well, the big situation right at the present time is that the municipality, I'm saying, under their oath of office, they have to respond to a criminal organization that commits treason to the king. But the problem is, it was the past municipal council that ordered this to happen. So it's they keep deferring the meetings. Nothing happens in council. They keep canceling the council meetings. The Ontario Ombudsman said, "Well, we're trying to deal with it." And
again, I think it's an example of the mess that we're in here and the lines of authority that are so confused. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Lots here to think about, and I think we're starting to wrap our arms around this beast a little bit, or at least get a better appreciation of the complexity of the issue. And I know for me, again, I think naively thinking that if we just have a referendum for independence, all will be well. I think we need to realize we're up against some long-standing forces, and you mentioned minefields. There's a lot of minefields out there that have to be navigated. Lloyd, did you want to give us an update on where things are at with the ostriches and your efforts to engage the RCMP?
Are we going to continue to record?
Thank you. I'm going to stop that.